I'm Jessie Munton. I'm an Associate Professor of Philosophy. Welcome to my exp. When we talk about the life of the mind, I think we're trying to describe and analyse at the broadest level all the ways in which our minds operate to produce our sense of self, the ways in which we reason, the feelings that we have. I think many of us feel closely identified with our minds. It can seem like the best way of capturing who we are. A lot of us perhaps have the intuition that if, for instance, you lost an arm or you lost a leg, that would be very challenging, but you'd still be the same person. So on the one hand, we have that sense of really close identification with our minds. On the other hand, we're often surprised at the ways in which they operate. They can sneak up on us. We can end up with beliefs or attitudes or behaviours that we don't necessarily endorse. So I find it fascinating to try and understand the ways in which the mind, whilst being the most intimate part of us, can also have this life that comes apart from our rational control. In philosophy of mind, these two concepts of perception and belief are very foundational, and a lot of my work is interested in understanding the relationship between them. In some ways, we want them to be quite distinct from one another. We want perception to be this direct confrontation with the world that can justify our belief states. In other ways, we want them to relate closely enough that, for instance, perception can justify belief, that there are ways that they can talk to each other. When we talk about perception, I think we are talking about the ways in which our senses present the world to us. So we hope that that lets us be in touch with reality in some sense. We often intuitively think of perception as something that kind of happens to us, something that we can't directly control, though I think there's reason to actually doubt that. This notion of belief in philosophy is very vexed and I think is under pressure from lots of directions. So most simply, beliefs are the representations that we have of how the world is. They might be grounded on perceptual experience, but they might also rely on other belief states that we have, on inferences between those. People tell us things. It's not just that we see how the world is. People tell us how the world is and then we form beliefs on the basis of that. One of the ways in which this concept of belief has come under a lot of pressure recently is recognising that our belief states don't always form a kind of unified whole. So there's this phenomenon of belief fragmentation where, for instance, perhaps you've committed to having lunch with somebody, you know perfectly well you're having lunch with somebody, but in another conversation you might make another commitment at the same time and then you realise that there was a mistake there, that you already had this commitment. So it's interesting that you might have beliefs that sometimes you can't quite access because you're busy with another task of some kind, for instance. It's also come under pressure with the recognition that sometimes you behave in ways that don't seem to correspond with the beliefs that you would endorse. And this is a particular problem in the context of bias, implicit bias and prejudice. So it might be that you disavow racist attitudes, but when we look at how you're behaving, it seems as though your behaviour is in line with those attitudes. Now, on a simplistic way of thinking about belief, belief translates very straightforwardly into behaviour. So what's happening here? Is it the case that you are mistaken about the beliefs that you have? Is it possible that you have multiple conflicting belief states? Sometimes when you have conflicting belief states, there are mechanisms that compel you to reconcile those. So it feels almost impossible to believe both that it's raining and it's not raining at the same time. You'd have to come to a reconciliation of that one way or another. So it's very interesting that in some cases, it seems like people can maintain inconsistent attitudes at the same time. And so I think some of the most interesting work in philosophy at the moment is kind of looking at the ways that this simple concept of belief is fracturing and trying to come up with more complex models of the mind that do a better job of capturing the nuance of our mental lives in those ways. When people talk about whether or not a belief is justified, often they have in mind whether or not it is apportioned to the evidence in the right way. I think that is a crucial determinant of whether a belief is justified, you want to recognise what evidence you have, and as far as possible, I think you do want to try and fit your beliefs to that evidence. There are other accounts of what it takes for something to be justified. You might want it to be the output of a reliable belief-forming process in some way. What I think is crucial to recognise, though, is that you could have multiple beliefs which all score equally in terms of justification. Perhaps they're all equally apportioned to the evidence. But that might not be the end of the story we want to tell about their epistemic status. In particular, it's going to be really important how you've gathered your evidence if we're using sensitivity to the evidence as a marker of justification. Because if the set of evidence that you're starting from is not representative or it's skewed in some way, then that's going to cause big downstream problems. You might say, well, it's terrific. I've got a belief set that's perfectly apportioned to my evidence. It's just that my evidence consists of this one book I've read and absolutely nothing else. That's not going to be a great epistemic situation that you're in. And so that's one of the reasons why I think we need to think about what you're attending to, because what you're attending to is going to determine what your evidence base is, and that in turn is going to determine which of your beliefs are justified. But we need to be able to say something about that kind of part of the process that is in some sense upstream, which is the bit of the process where you are even selecting what your evidence is. Philosophers have been very cagey of saying that we have a duty to believe. One reason for that is it can seem to generate an excessive number of duties. So for instance, you might think, well, look, if you've got good evidence for something, you should form a belief on the basis of it. One reason to not do that is perceptually you have so much evidence. You have way more evidence than you could possibly form beliefs on the basis of. So we have to allow that some degree of selectivity is fine. That's got to be kind of baked in, it's okay that you're not forming every belief that you could possibly form. But then we face this really tricky question, which is, well, which beliefs should you form? If we're not saying that you've got a duty to believe everything that you could believe, which things is it going to be that you should believe? And at this point, we get into some really interesting questions about the extent to which epistemology and, for instance, ethics or practical priorities should be independent from one another. Because one answer you might naturally give to that is, well, you should believe the important things. Which are the important things? Now, we could give kind of an epistemologist's answer to that, where you just say the kind of most foundational beliefs, the beliefs that have the most implications rationally for other things. But as humans who live with other humans and who have to survive in the world, intuitively what's important is also the kinds of beliefs that are, morally important, that may be about other people, about the ways in which other people matter to us. And also just practical beliefs, if you've got a choice, at some point you've got to form beliefs that let you continue to survive, even if they aren't the beliefs that let you learn most quickly about the world. So we want to have ways to describe what is happening when the mind is not functioning optimally in some way. We might describe that as a failure, but I hesitate to use this word because it kind of implies a clearer black and white distinction between when the mind is operating right and when it's not operating right than I think is really there. Because of the fact that we have this kind of overwhelm of information, I don't think our best approach is going to be to say, this is what you should attend to, this is what you shouldn't attend to. What I'm trying to do is describe a broad evaluative framework that says, look, in an optimal situation, maybe we would attend in this way. We're going to fall short of that all the time in all sorts of ways, and then we need a range of kind of nuanced resources to describe the various different ways in which we might fall short from that optimal standard. Some of the ways in which we might fall short of that standard might just result in us not learning very effectively. So maybe particularly as we get older, we can become a bit less curious about the world. We can become quite comfortable in our attention being trammelled in familiar ways. We focus just on a few topics that are of interest to us. We stop asking certain questions. And practically that might not cause any problems to us, but epistemically perhaps it's a loss that we're no longer exposing ourselves to new information on different topics, and that can cause some social problems as well. Sometimes it can be much more severe than that. So one of the ways in which prejudice and bias operate are that we attend to some of the information we have disproportionately whilst neglecting other information that we have. If we're prejudiced against a particular group, it might be, for instance, that we attend disproportionately to negative properties of that group. Even though we have beliefs that are more positive, we're not prioritising those, we're not using those in the ways in which we are reasoning. This can also be a problem when it comes to how we're selecting the body of evidence on the basis of which we're forming our beliefs. So if we don't maintain a kind of flexibility in our attentional patterns, it might be that there is evidence which is intuitively relevant to the kinds of questions that we're trying to resolve that we end up neglecting. And as a result of that, downstream, we end up forming beliefs which are less fitted for letting us function in the world, because although they fit the evidence, they only fit some subset of the evidence. If there was one preconception about the life of the mind and how the mind operates that I want to resist, it's that the primary focus of our interest should be on the beliefs that we end up forming. I think it's absolutely crucial that we think about how we're prioritising and ordering information, both because that determines what beliefs we end up forming, and also it plays a role in what we do with those beliefs downstream. The way I think about the mind, that process of prioritising and ordering and structuring information is absolutely foundational, probably more important than the kind of explicit content of the beliefs that we do have. And I think it's that I really want us to pay more attention to.